Bula and welcome to the lands at 177. The first indentured laborers or Girmitiers from India arrived in Fiji on May 14, 1879. And May 14 this year will mark the 144th anniversary of their arrival into a country that many would go on to call home. From the first ship, the Leonidas, followed by 86 other vessels, 60,965 Girmitiers traveled to Fiji from 1879 to 1916 until Girmit ended on January 1st, 1920. Today, their descendants make up almost 40% of the total population of Fiji, and their contribution to the economic, social, and cultural growth of the country is well evident. The Fiji Times is privileged to have two key people in the organization of Fiji's first ever Girmit Day celebration. Bula, Assistant Minister, and Bula Sir. We have with us Assistant Minister Sashi Kiran and Dr. Ganesh Chand, a renowned academic, and also the convener of the Global Girmit Conference. So I will begin by asking Madam Assistant Minister first, how does it feel to finally be acknowledged and recognized nationally?
Long overdue. It brings back a lot of memories as we've been researching and doing the work. And high time we started not only acknowledging the contributions, but remembering the pain that our ancestors went through and acknowledging it. So very grateful that for the first time it's a national holiday.
Thank you. And Dr. Chanjo?
Yes, certainly, same. I'm very pleased. I see it more as a nation-building exercise, and that's significant for all of us.
For many years, we've had talk about convening something like this, but no one actually did it until the coalition government came along. So I believe there's a lot to be grateful for to Prime Minister Rambuka and his team for actually making that first bold step. It is a bold step for Fiji. I'll start off with Madam Assistant Minister. Today is the commemoration of the wreck of the Syria at Naivila village in Norway, and the declaration of a peace village. What does that actually mean?
So thank you. In 1884, when the sixth ship, Syria, was wrecked on Nasalai Reef, when it hit the reef, it was on Sunday evening, and the records say that the boat broke immediately and some people died. And it also vividly talks about how people were hanging onto the boat to survive. And by the morning, when the waters went down, you could the villagers actually saw that crash. And Navilada talked to Turangati and they went to rescue the people. And they started work from Monday, day, evening, next day, Tuesday. And Tuesday afternoon, Andrew McGregor, who was at that time the head, the colonial administration, they came to rescue. Also, if I can quickly say that by the time McGregor came, there were about only 100 people left in the boat. So you can imagine villages in the smaller boats moved more than 400 people across. Also, we are told that people who died are buried, and I've been to the gravesite in the village. We do acknowledge that some people might have floated to other villages, some did, and they may be buried in other villages, but there's a graveyard in Navilada. And we are told that the people who were injured were actually recovering in the village. And when the smaller boats came, whatever was in Fiji, and people were moved to Suva, but 100 men had to walk from Navilada to Suva because there were not enough boats to move them. But what struck me about it, imagine how different we must have looked, and the language difference. Our people must have been very traumatized, having traveled through the seas, seeing an accident, losing people, a lot of fear probably. And the ancestors of the land actually reached out, helped them, looked after them, and buried them. And since then, when they clear their graveyards, their ancestors' graveyards, they have been cleaning our graveyards as well. So there has been a very deep connection to that land. And I was very shocked. We talked about it in the early days. There was a lot of this history was not known because Nasalai, so we always assumed Tailevu. So when we reached out to Tailevu Provincial Council, they were quiet, and then we reached out to Imbao, Ratu Chaniman Bibi, and he said it was a Rewa story. So something got lost in history. And villagers have said that they are open to educate us, because as Indian people, Indo-origin people, we don't really understand the Fijian system. So Peace Village would mean that we will be able to organize events where people of other cultures can come and learn indigenous language and culture.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Chan, your event is billed as the largest ever gathering of top international scholars of Girmit in the world. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. Girmit as a subject of study is quite recent. It started in the 60s with some European scholars, 70s, and then it picked up mid-70s onwards. There have been scholars in different countries, South Africa, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Mauritius, and Fiji, of course, Brijlal's name, and Ahmad Ali. These were two of our lead, Vijay Naidu later on. So there was a generation of scholars, 70s and early 80s. That was the pioneering generation who did research on Girmitians. That generation, some have passed on, some are still alive. Right. Then, of course, newer people came on board. So far, there have been a lot of smaller gatherings to discuss Girmit research. Never have all the top minds been brought together. Right. So this is the first time ever that all the top minds were invited, and most of them would be participating. Many of them are already here, and some would be arriving later today into Suva. Three of them actually, they are participating, but because of health reasons, they could not take the long distance travel. So they will be participating by Zoom. So it's very thrilling, yes, to get the top names in Girmit research to be participating in one conference, and that too in Fiji.
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, we have lost Dr. Brijlal, but will his wife, Dr. Padma, be?
Yes, Padma would be here. There's a special, we have about 9 or 10 sessions. There's one special session on Brijlal, so it's a tribute to Brijlal, where all those scholars who worked with him, who researched him, they'll be talking, and Padma is also part of that.
Thank you very much. We will now take a break, and we'll be back very shortly.
Win a Swire Shipping Fijian Drawer Kids jersey. Simply like, share, and follow our Fiji Times Kyla Facebook page, then tag in a friend on your shared post and mention who your favorite Swire Shipping Fijian Drawer player is. All reactions will then go into a draw to win one of 2 Fijian Drawer jerseys, totally up for grabs. Conditions apply.
Bola, and welcome back to the Lens at 177. Today we are discussing the first ever historic Girmit Day celebration for Fiji, and we have with us 2 esteemed people involved in the planning of our inaugural event. I'll ask Madam Assistant Minister, on Friday there's a visit to Nukulau. We understand it's the first landing and quarantine center for the indentured laborers. And there's plans to launch a billboard and ecotourism launch. Could you just share with us?
Sure. So, well, it's not technically the first landing. The Leonidas, because of disease outbreak, actually that landed on, the Ilailai near Levuka. But from second ship onwards, about 60,000 people were landed on Nukulau. I went there to have a look. There, if you really look at it, there are a lot of remnants from the past. There are different concrete slabs still, and I'm sure now with archives we'll go back and map it. And one thing that we realize when we talk to everybody is people do not remember how many ships, how many people came and what happened to them. So that would be the beginning of a launch. It's just an acknowledgement that Nukulau Island was one of the first places, or the first place, except for the first lot, where our people landed. And were quarantined for 4 to 6 weeks. Some died and are buried on the island. So it's important to acknowledge that, and we're working with Ministry of Lands to eventually work and develop that as one of the heritage sites.
Dr. Chand, you were sharing a bit about how they were quarantined and fumigated and all this. Could you just share a little bit about that?
Yes. When the endangered workers were brought in, they were brought in hundreds in relatively small ships. So the living space was very congested. They were put all together, cramped. A lot of people got ill on the ships. Many died, and they were buried, well, thrown overboard. That was the burial. So naturally there would be diseases, and the European colonial government at that time was very, very fearful of spreading disease in the country. Fiji had just emerged from that period of massive death of indigenous through measles brought by Europeans.
Right.
So they didn't want a similar thing to be repeated. So quarantine was pretty strict. People would have to be passed through quarantine, and one of the things was that they were kind of chemically treated, so that all the diseases are washed out and all that.
And I saw that. I saw a chamber from those times with an attachment like a drum, like a capsule, you know. And we'll have to research that a little bit, but it sounded like, the people there were saying that that was probably used for fumigation. But the room attached to it is very small. You wonder how many people will be pushed through.
So that was the protection for the rest of the Fiji from introduction of diseases.
I'll continue with you if you don't mind. The global conference, as you mentioned, is the first ever convening of Girmit scholars, first ever. So, you know,
not quite. There have been many conventions, conferences in Fiji. This is our fourth one. In Trinidad, Suriname, there have been many. But this is the first getting everyone of that generation together.
So what does it hope to achieve?
Well, like a conference, we want more sharing of research knowledge. When people research, there is certain result, certain outcome, certain finding. That is shared in conferences. And that sharing eventually either rejects or validates the findings. So once those are validated, they become knowledge. So conferences generally, that is the intent. You bring your research, share it with peers, they'll criticize it, they will endorse it, they'll give some new suggestions. Either that idea, the finding is rejected for lack of merit or data or whatever it be, analysis, or they are validated. And that's how knowledge grows. I'll give an example. At the very beginning, you started with the introduction today, that the indentured laborers landed here on 14th May 1879. Now that is something that we have believed in, but historically that's not correct. So research shows the ship came on the evening of 14th May into our waters near Levuka, but the people landed on 26th May. So the actual setting of foot of the Girmitians on Fiji land is 26th May. So these are the kind of things which research brings out.
So why attain the difference?
Yes, when the ship landed, the governor, acting governor at that time, DeVoe, was very worried because there were some people who had diseases on the ship, and the ship, that information was spread to the governor. Governor said, look, turn back the ship. The governor wanted to turn back the ship into open waters and maybe back to India. So better minds prevailed. His advice, look, instead of turning it back, we will create a quarantine and then put them there. So that was the Lailai Allen. The governor at that time, acting governor, he commanded the people of Maturiki and of Lau to build bures.
Right.
So building of the bures and preparing the accommodation and the facilities, it took that long. So once all these were completed, then they started transporting people from the ship to the land.
Wow.
And that started on 26th of May.
Right.
It went on for 3 days. Just transporting from the ship to the quarantine. So conferences are important because we correct things which we have believed for reasons of history. People someone started and then it was perpetuated.
And Dr. Ganesh has also done a few papers on the Navilada story, which was not recorded in our history before.
Yes, definitely. That's another interesting one. The fact that people believe that it was the colonial government which rescued
Right.
all the passengers. And that's what was believed, and that was believed until recently. When we dug up, it was the Ravens who had rescued 400 or so people. Without asking, it was their initiative, as well as the church. There was a church group which came. They rescued a lot of people.
Okay.
So,
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. May the 14th should really have been May the 26th. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back straight after this.
Win a Swire Shipping Fiji Endura Kids jersey. Simply like, share, and follow our Fiji Times Skylar Facebook page, then tag in a friend on your shared post and mention who your favorite Swire Shipping Fiji Endura player is. All reactions will then go into a draw to win one of 2 Fiji Endura jerseys, totally up for grabs. Conditions apply.
Mula, and welcome back to the Lens at 177. We are here discussing with Honorable Assistant Minister Sashi Kiran and Dr. Kadesh Chand about our inaugural Girmit Day celebration. There's been a lot of discussion and narrative along the lines of the Girmitians being used as slaves in Fiji and a lot of the discomfort that they faced at the hands of their owners. But not a lot has been said about how the Itoke people embraced them and accepted them in Fiji, their home away from home. And along with that, there was those who could not return for whatever reason and may have longed to return to India, but they came to realize that they had an opportunity for a better life in Fiji and amongst the Itoke people. So just your thoughts on that.
I'll begin at the end. My grandfather actually tried to go many times. And he tells the story of how after finishing, he came towards the end of Girmit. So my grandfather is the first and my father, firstborn and I'm second. He writes and he was really agitated to go back. And 3 times he went and explains how he was told to come back and there was no place. And even after, he continued to write there to India. And recently I found those roots. But it was not an easy time for those people as well. And one thing you'll see, this theme is inclusivity and diversity. Our people had an impact on everybody who is here, I'm sure, and everybody else had an impact on our journey. Indigenous people not only embraced us in Navilada, but there are many stories. And there's a book written by Ambassador Ajay Singh, late Ambassador Ajay Singh, who talks about how his grandmother was supported by the chiefs of Ra to be brought to a church where she found rescue for three years to fight for her husband who was jailed. Tota Ram Sananthia talks about how Fijians assisted him. So they were, people of the land really did a lot for our support, and we haven't actually researched enough or narrated that enough. Churches played a huge role. Dudley, when Hannah Dudley had the boarding, then many of the Indian girls had, higher education. The orphanages, Anglican and Methodist Church. So a lot was done, and it's time for us to really remember the ties and the bonds we had together. Towards the end of indenture, indenture, the colonials had tried to keep them separate. But even Turanga Tuinodo said when there was a work required, like Turanga Tuinodo was sharing, that even Fijians were put in a place and they had needed Buli's permission to go. So it was not that the indigenous Fijians were completely free, you could correct me there. But so both communities were heavily impacted by the colonials, but they had developed relationships, and we've exchanged so much traditions over a period of time. We are a unique group of people, and not only indigenous people and Indians, but there are Chinese, there are part Europeans. We've had strong relationships, and I think it needs to be celebrated and acknowledged that we have been there in each other's thick and thin.
Thank you. Dr. Chan,
Yes, very correct. It needs to be researched, thoroughly researched. Our knowledge of what actually happened in Fiji since 1879 is very weak. We know only the superficial story is relayed by people, books written by people who have done shallow studies. The Syria story is a typical one, where the indigenous people went and saved the indentured workers from drowning. They buried the dead. Now in the Fijian culture tradition, my understanding is that relationships are built on three things: birth, where you are born and your lineage; marriage; and death. Now most people don't know that's exactly the same for the Indians. Our relationships are built on birth, marriage, and death. Now the fact that Indians who had a re-life, the Syria Indians, and that's a new life, that was because of the hands of the indigenous. The 39 whom they could find, the dead who were buried, no, that's death. Now that bond hasn't been written about. So we need to research that. And there are so many such cases, not of course that extreme, but cases of people living together. I'll give one example which could be current. At the moment, if you look at prison population in Fiji, for whatever reason, 80% or so is indigenous Fijians. But in those days, 80-90% of the prison population was Indians, not indigenous Fijians. Now, most of them were in petty to big criminal offenses, MEDA, but there were also smaller criminal offenses, but a large number of them were breaching of contracts. So the people would run away, and where would they run away to? The only place was the Fijian village. So they'll go there, and the Fijian village would accept them, harbor them, treat them well, feed them, house them. But of course that was illegal, because you could not harbor these people. These things haven't been researched or written about. So there is a need, and I call upon the government, and I'm going to give a formal proposal to the government on a special fund to research Fiji's history. Because we need to know Fijians and Indians haven't been apart as projected in those days. They live together. So we need to celebrate that.
If I may add, for us, the eldest son gives the burial. So for us, the people who gave the burial to the Indians, they did the duty of the first son. And we'll be always grateful to them for burying our dead. And I also want to acknowledge, Dr. Ganesh said, out of the 54 disappeared, 39 are buried there. They may have been buried by other villagers even around Pailevu, and we need to acknowledge all the villagers who came around that place.
So there's a lot to be researched, a lot to know. There are critics who say, well, what for? I'm saying because that's the foundation of life and living in Fiji. We need to do that.
I also believe that, the race card has been played for too long, and we need to tell these stories to remind the people that there's a long and deep relationship between both ethnicities, and like you both shared with us. You also shared that the Fiji Times had a role to play.
Strong.
Yes, Fiji Times had a...
Could you share a bit about that?
Fiji Times has been, of course, the oldest newspaper. It used to write for the planters, the planter interest at that time. And that time the European interest was not necessarily aligned with the interest of colonial government. They were often at loggerheads. So Fiji Times used to expose a lot of things which won't come out in the official stories. And for me, Fiji Times is a very valuable source of information. Authentic, because people would write letters, so there will be information published at that time. I think it was known as Suva Times at some stage, but the same entity, which now is Fiji Times, it played a critical role.
Yes.
So.
Well, I just wanted to go back to Naivilava. I had the pleasure of accompanying Assistant Minister on a trip there, and I noticed the way that they treat you and welcome you in the village. And it's unique. Could you share a bit about how you...
Yeah, absolutely. For me, this area was very new. I'm from West Bengal, so I didn't know the place. But every time they would call, I've been with them, gone to Syria and all that. And you don't understand it from an outside, but there is a love. Because they've always, their narrative is that the Indians belong there. So whether you know it or not, they have this very deep love, like there's an affection. And when I go in that space, I feel very safe and very protected. And the minute I joined politics, for example, they reached out and said, So I made sure that I went and said, I just wanted to acknowledge them as our ancestors as well. I also want to say that you talked about with Dr. Ganesh why is it important. I believe, and there is a reconciliation and Thanksgiving on Sunday. I believe our people are very traumatized, and we never talk and acknowledge that. So there was a Girmit history, and you hear normally in narratives when we talk about Girmit, we talk about an era, as if that era ended, and then there's us. We sort of, in our conversations, don't really say that we are offsprings of that slavery or whatever form it came. And it's easy to deny the pain of that time because maybe we don't want to acknowledge it. And I think these spaces are important for us to acknowledge that we are a product of those traumas, intergenerational traumas, and then the traumas of coup and so on. And maybe we are restless and we are traveling and we're behaving in a particular way, which probably hasn't been researched. But how does intergenerational trauma work in the current day? If we don't acknowledge the past, heal from the past, then we probably are passing down the intergenerational trauma on a continuous basis to new generations.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our show, but we're so grateful, Assistant Minister Kinan and Dr. Chan, for your invaluable insights into the Girmits and the Girmitians. And we hope to have both of our guests back on the lens at 177 in the not too distant future to share about how the celebrations went. So from us all here at Bud Street, thank you very much. Morning.